Hey, Jonathan, it's really great to see you. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Hi, Steve. It's great to see you too.
So much has happened since we first met, and I thought I'd share that story quickly. Um, I was heading to, and you were heading to Grand Lake Stream for David Kotok's annual Camp Kotok. So economists and hedge fund managers, ex-Fed officials, really kind of a think tank of everything that's going on. It's a ton of fun, and it's surrounded by fishing and other things. And when we met, I picked you up in the Bangor airport in a rental car, and we spent 2 hours driving up to Grand Lake Stream, and you took me to school on all things China. And I want to begin this discussion because uh, I had zero idea as to what was happening. Your book, China's Vision of Victory, which we'll talk about. And from there on the way up and then on the way back, I was a changed man. So give me, give me your take, the experience at Camp Kotok, and then we'll talk about your history and what motivated you and the passion you have behind getting this message out.
Well, thanks, Steve. And that really was a great and memorable ride that we took. And it was in 2019, right after China's Vision of Victory had come out, where I'd laid out basically the global grand strategy of the Chinese government in their own words and documents, that had been assembled really through a bunch of different kinds of experience. On one hand, my PhD at Oxford, where I've been using primary documents to see how they looked at things in different periods of history. Then also my work for the US Department of Defense as a consultant, where I'd looked at the future of Chinese strategy. And, in China's Vision of Victory, I mean, some of the fundamental conclusions had to do with, their military strategy and also their economic strategy. But heading to Camp Kotok with you, a great gathering of leading economists and chief investment officers and people that are really outstanding in those fields. As I was starting to get into this whole concept of the economic competition and ultimately how to win it. And that's what I've done with the new book. The Decisive Decade is about how to win this contest. In that sense, it's a response to China's Vision of Victory. It's really the second edition. I mean, China's Vision of Victory is the Chinese strategy in their words, and this is a strategy for the United States of America, but it's based very, very heavily on economic competition. Because to me, this is ultimately, I mean, it's a geopolitical situation. It's everything. It's economics, it's military, it's diplomacy, it's history, it's ideology, it's the entire encyclopedia of what it means to compete for power. But I think we have this window in which to win the geopolitical competition based on economic power. And that's something that, in a way, has troubled me since I was first getting attuned to this situation with China. That goes all the way back to my days as a language student and my travels around the People's Republic of China. And, back when I was in my early 20s learning about this and, exploring that country, everybody around me was saying, look at China, the rise of China. This is a major economic opportunity. And it's all about economic opportunity. And the entire national narrative in Chinese language was about economic growth, how fast it was, what that meant for the future. And I was thinking, is anyone thinking about the consequences of this rise, of this economic growth? And I think largely we did not. At a strategic level, the U.S. was hoping that economic interdependency, that sort of China taking a stake in the global economy, would lead to security and would lead to a U.S. partnership with China that would, sort of be sustainable, and that we could always have a military hedge against that. And in fact, that was just never really true. I mean, that did not account for China's real intentions. It did not account for the history of the Communist Party of China, what they sought to achieve through their rise, the military dimension of their rise, which was always there in their strategic thinking. And as someone who became a scholar on many of those dimensions, I always was wondering, how could we defeat this? How can we beat this? How can we actually win in the geopolitical contest and preserve America's future as the primary superpower and
So
not
what,
lose that to the
at what
PRC?
at what point did the lights turn on for you that said, "Oh boy, we have a big problem"? At what point do you think, at the highest levels within our government, the lights turn on, and where are businesses in terms of this today?
Sure. So the lights for me happened really early on when I was about 22, traveling in Xinjiang in Tibet. So regions that we now know are the sites essentially of genocide by the Communist Party of China. I spent months out there hitchhiking with truck drivers, living in, staying in villages and getting to know some sides of this that made the human rights side incredibly clear. And that was very alarming to me at that time, particularly in contrast with people's main idea about China, which was economic opportunity. So for me, it was that. Then I went and developed that more as I did the PhD and explored, more widely in the world and got a deeper sense of China as a global power. So in any case, I was on this long journey that's lasted almost 20 years now. And for the US government, separate category, of course, I think the real turning point came in the past administration, the Trump administration, when real action was taken on this issue. The Biden administration has continued some of the good things there, and they've, made clear that we're in a competition with China. I mean, we're all living in that today. We can see the continuity. Prior to that, I don't think there was a real focus on China as an adversary, and there certainly was not sort of a turning of the whole flipping the table on its head, so to speak, and saying, look, engagement isn't working. We have these problems in economics. We have this problem with their military. I mean, there were some hints of that maybe with the pivot to Asia in the Obama administration, but that wasn't executed on really. So I think we've reached this turning point as a nation in only the past 4 or 5 years, or maybe 6 at most. But even then, there's this national awakening that goes with that. I mean, there's so much more that needs to be done. And as you rightly point out, with businesses, that's a totally different story. And in the decisive decade, H.R. McMaster, the former national security advisor, addressed it to the business leaders of the free world, which I requested that he do, because I always thought if George F. Kennan were alive today, dealing with the U.S.-China competition, he wouldn't be writing to Washington. He'd be writing to the C-suites, boards, and financial institutions of America, because the only chance we've got left, in my view, to win the geopolitical competition is to secure our economic advantages while we still have them. And that is not really the purview of US government. And that's what makes this contest so unique. We've had our businesses on our side in the Second World War and the Cold War, but in this case, we're going to need them more than ever. And I think that this is going to be a combination, in a sense, of Washington and Wall Street and everybody else. That's how we have to win. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think businesses truly get this. And that's going to be very important.
Doing business with any Chinese company is doing business with their military.
Well, I'd say that you're doing business with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, you're not escaping the system. And the system, in that sense, is an integrated one where the party dominates, their approach to their own corporations. And I've laid this all out in a lot of detail in the decisive decade, whether it's directly owned corporations, state-owned enterprises, or state-backed enterprises, some of the big tech companies, which they didn't build, but certainly exert influence, if not control over when they want to. I mean, yes, you're in that system and you're participating in the rise of America's adversary. And, for the self-interest of businesses, I mean, you don't come out of this well. I mean, what's good for General Motors is good for America, let's say the old saw goes, but, what's bad for America is also going to be bad for General Motors. So, as we, create this sort of losing competition because we are giving them all these economic and technological advantages, our companies are going to get, wiped out in a lot of key sectors in the long run as well.
Do you feel that because you must be talking to certain US corporations, you don't need to name them, but do you feel that they're hearing your message?
Well, sure. And I've been working with, American companies for the past 6 years now, a lot of large market leaders in strategic industries. I mean, that's been the fun thing about Atlas is I've gotten to sort of, find my way around the major strategic industries, working with all kinds of great companies. And I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, there are all kinds of things out there. I mean, I think there are always people inside companies that understand the changes here that need to be made, the nature of risk. And I think we're starting to see in a more general way that geopolitical risk is taking a higher priority, let's say at a board level or at a C-suite level. But I don't believe that companies really and truly know what to do across the board. I don't believe that they're getting the right sort of long-term strategic advice. They're not necessarily seeing that in a global context. This is not just about the China market. This is about dealing with a global situation. All kinds of emerging markets and developed markets need to be part of corporate strategies now. And I think there's also still often a kind of misplaced optimism for the US-China relationship that I think really does not account for the nature of China's real strategy or the nature of what will be the necessary US response. At the end of the day, You can send cabinet level officials over there, but we're not going to talk our way out of what they call the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. That's not something that America is going to finesse through diplomacy. It's going to be a competition that we have to win. And, to put all those pieces together, to really understand it intellectually and be able to form strategy around that, I think companies aren't there yet, and above all, we're going to need them to do that in order to succeed at this. So I think it's going to be this coming together of U.S. national security and foreign policy with American business and finance that may, in a way, it has never really happened before at this kind of scale, or at this scale, I think, which will be needed. And hopefully we'll go through that change in the 2020s. And if we don't, I think we're going to set ourselves up for the geopolitics of the later half of this decade that will be absolutely astonishing to us in a very bad way.
Kinetic.
Well, sure. I mean, we're also talking about a very high and real risk of military conflict. I mean, that we can talk about today. And, as somebody who, to some degree, is a military historian of modern China, yeah, I mean, that's something people should be taking very seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. Not good news. Today, this morning, I'm driving in and I'm listening to Tom Keene on Bloomberg News, and he's talking about, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, but Zhongrong International Trust Company. So we've heard here in the States a lot about Evergrande, the group, the big real estate group, and some of the challenges they have. One of the larger real estate groups just essentially defaulted on their loan, a real big one. And the trust company, who's been a lot of the feeder to the capital that's gotten into this cement expansion real estate strategy that really has reached a point to nowhere. Any thoughts around what sort of economic state China is in, because real estate is such a large portion of certainly all the individuals and their wealth. What are your thoughts there?
Sure. So the housing market, which I think Wall Street is certainly very knowledgeable about and focused on, and I think that's one of the important things for us to discuss here is that it's possible to be very knowledgeable about the Chinese economy without necessarily understanding what this means when it comes to geopolitics, international risk, Chinese strategy, national security, all those other factors to the four-dimensional chessboard, let's say, that also matter, and of which the economy is one very important piece, but not the only piece. So, people have studied that very carefully. They understand that, and whether you can add up some of the problems with the Chinese economy, whether it's the housing sector, youth unemployment, the potential for deflation, which we're starting to hear about now. I mean, we'll see if that's transitory or not. But there are the softening of trade, the fact that they're very dependent on the external, especially Western markets for trade and for demand. The inability to truly rebalance to a consumer-led economy. I mean, these sorts of things, I think, are pretty clearly understood, or at least acknowledged at this point. But we're also dealing with that in the context of a geopolitical strategy and an economic strategy which seeks dominance of the world economy. And I think there have been ways in which they've actually been very successful at their own strategy. Not least of which is becoming the world's second largest economy. And I don't think anything that we're talking about today will change that for them. But they are, for instance, in certain strategic industries and also industries we don't think of as strategic. They're dominant. Whether you can look at things like Made in China 2025, you can look at individual companies that have spooked the world and still survived, such as Huawei. You can look at the auto export sector, where they are now the main leading exporter in the world, and you can look at things like shipbuilding. These are industries that they targeted in a very, I think, honestly sophisticated way in order to lead in those things. And that's leaving aside the entire question of technology, whether it's AI or quantum or semiconductors, and there are aspects of all of those strategies that people take very seriously in the policy community and in the technology community. But above all, this idea of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is about returning themselves to the center stage in the world. And what that really means on one level is becoming the dominant economic power. And they've achieved that to some extent, let's say, in global goods trade. I mean, if we look at emerging markets around the world and the plurality of nations that have China as the top trading partner and not the United States, and that was a fundamentally different picture 20 years ago. I mean, those are the real strategic challenges that the U.S. is going to have to deal with in, economic strategy. And then you go to capital markets, for example, where, I mean, we're still pumping enormous amounts of capital into China. This has started to capture the attention of Congress, MSCI and BlackRock, passive
Mhm.
indexes, those sorts of things. I think we are going to have a more serious national conversation about that. But bottom line, I mean, there's still a major economic contender with very serious strategies. So the softening in their economy does not obviously get us out of the question of economic competition, but it does provide an opportunity for the United States to achieve what I think is the most important thing, which is to remain the world's largest economy and the most sophisticated economy. And I say that because as a historian, I mean, that is the basis of American power. Since the Second World War, we have been the biggest game in town by so much. And this is the first time that we're really flirting with the idea of an economic rival that can, catch up to us or even surpass us, whether in certain industries or sectors or aspects of global economics or overall. And let's not forget that until, somewhat recently, many, many people have been forecasting, including very important CEOs and investment leaders, that China would surpass the United States as the main economic power within, let's say, 10 years from now. People keep rolling it back, but I think that idea still exists. And this is something where I think the United States needs to be focused on ensuring that they never close the gap. And then we have to be able to convert that into the kind of military power that leads to long-term deterrence. And that's how you win an overall grand strategic competition. And that's what I've written about in The Decisive Decade. The ability to win an economic competition, maintain peace through strength, and transform the geopolitics of the 21st century from those of an ascending, rising China to one of a contained China, and therefore to preserve the American-led order.
So do you think we've grown a little bit too soft, a little bit too dependent, certainly on lowest cost of goods, manufacturing, and but just as a nation, are we hungry enough? Have we lost some of that edge? I know that's a tough question, but I'm curious from your vantage point.
Steve, it's a great question. And I split the book into four arenas where I talk about the economic arena, the military arena, the diplomatic idea arena, and excuse me, and then the arena of ideas, because I do think, this matters in history. I mean, your sense of determination of where you're going, of, do you have essentially the resolve to meet great challenges? And I think that's been a very important characteristic of the United States over the past 100 years. I mean, you can look back to the Greatest Generation, to many very clear ideas that we had about our role in the world, which I think have been, challenged and to some extent even lost here. And I think we are going to have a clear concept of American leadership, of its role in the world, of the free world, of our sense of essentially responsibility to this problem set, not only for our own security, but for the greater prospect of humanity in the world. And I think when you're dealing with something that could be this big, this transformative, we've dealt with grand scale adversaries before, whether that was the Axis powers of the Second World War and their vision for world order, or the Soviet Union and sort of the global communist movement, which had a vision of global order, or certainly the People's Republic of China, which also has that vision, and one that I articulated, through their own documents in China's Vision of Victory. So we're dealing with something that seeks to transform the world as we know it, the present and the future. They may not be successful at that, and I believe it can be stopped. I believe they are slowing down to some extent based on their own problems, not least of which is that they've alerted much of the world to the nature of their intentions, and that really matters. But I think it still requires a considerable American role. And then again, that's not just from Washington. I mean, again, I don't believe this country succeeds when only Washington understands something. It will have to be understood by the wider, American public. But I also think that business and finance leaders will have a unique and absolutely vital role to play in this. And that's the best thing that I think we can accomplish in the short term. And I think the absence of that will lead to geopolitical catastrophes. So, I'd like us to see, in order to move farther down the path of having a genuine and effective American grand strategy and response to China, the next stop is the C-suite and the boardrooms of America.
Well, you turned my awareness up high back in 2019. And as I watch and I read, not only other analysts, your message is really the lead message that's happening here. So, number one, thank you for playing such an important role. This is meaningful to everybody. in a big night. Number two, keep it up, keep the fight, and keep that megaphone out there blasting loud. The book is The Decisive Decade by Jonathan Ward. Jonathan, how else can people follow you?
Oh, sure. I guess on LinkedIn primarily, to some extent on Twitter, and also I go on a lot of television and radio.
Really much appreciated. Thanks, my friend. Good seeing you.
Thank you, Stephen. Always great to see you too.